everyone. I'm Teresa Duryea Wong, and it's great to be with you today. Today, we have a very special panel of amazing women who are about to join us. We are going to talk about the recommittal ceremony for Harriet Powers and the new headstone that was placed at the gravesite of Harriet and Armistead Powers in Athens, Georgia last December. It's an article that we covered for the Quiltfolk Georgia edition, so we hope you'll check that out. And I'm a writer for Quiltfolk, and I had the privilege of being at that ceremony. And now I want to introduce you to each of these special panelists. So first, I want to introduce Aisha Carter Amos, and Aisha lives in Georgia, in Atlanta. Yep. Yes. And we're very excited to have her with us today. Aisha is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Harriet and Armistead Powers. And in a few minutes, we'll let her tell her story of how her family discovered these connections and has followed Harriet and her quilts as well.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for joining us. We also have Kyra Hicks. Kyra is an author and a quilt historian and a quilter as well. She's the author of several books, but one very important book about Harriet and her quilts titled This I Accomplish, Harriet Powers Bible Quilt and Other Pieces. And if you haven't read her book, I highly recommend you go and get a copy right away. It is excellent. When you read the book, you're going to feel like you're just going on this journey right alongside Kyra as she discovers all the paths that these quilts took to get to where they are today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here, Teresa. Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, Dr. Carolyn Mazloomi is a National Endowments for the Arts National Heritage Fellow. She is also a major collector of contemporary African American quilts. She is a curator. She is an artist also, and we're going to see one of her quilts today. She is the author of, numerous books, countless magazine articles. She's also the founder of the Women of Colors Quilters Network, and Carolyn and that organization were the driving force behind the project to place a new headstone at Harriet's grave in Athens, Georgia.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Swope. Jennifer is the David and Roberta Logie Curator of Textile and Fashion Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And this museum is fortunate to be the home of one of Harriet's two quilts. The Pictorial Quilt is part of their permanent collection. This amazing quilt was on view a few years ago in early 2021. And it'll be on view again this summer. And Jennifer will certainly tell us a little bit more about that in just a minute.
Thanks, Teresa. Nice to be here today.
Thank you so much. So Carolyn, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about this journey to place this headstone at the cemetery, the Gospel Pilgrim Cemetery in Athens, Georgia, and kind of a little bit of maybe the backstory of what it all took to get this done.
I think this begins with our network member, Peggy Hartwell and Sandy Benjamin Hannibal, and this has been about 20 years ago. Peggy Hartwell had the opportunity to meet one of the great-great-great-granddaughters of Harriet Powers, who lived in, I believe, upstate New York. And gosh, that's been about 30 years ago. And wow. She became fascinated with finding the actual grave site of Harriet Powers and spent years trying to do that. But she was unsuccessful. It was only until a grad student at the University of Georgia found the site that they located it, and network members were actually able to go there. Recently, I would say 2 years ago, Sandy Benjamin Hannibal and Peggy Hartwell tried to find the grave site, and they could not because the markers were gone and the headstone was gone. So they had no way to locate locate the grave site. And after they told me the headstone was gone, that I thought was terrible. Everybody deserves a headstone. So I made a decision right then and there. For me, I hate problems, okay, and I like instant results. So I thought, okay, I'll just get another headstone. And I wanted something that was very nice. And I contacted Kyra, and she helped design it, and we were quite pleased with the results. And I have to say, I just added a meditation bench to that gravesite location as well.
That is fantastic.
So
Yeah.
members of the Women of Color Quilters Network have always been fascinated by the life and quilts of Harriet Powers. It was a life of struggle as a poor woman, but also an artistic life with the creation of these two wonderful quilts that she made. In particular, there's a love affair with the Bible quilt. And many people would ask why. And I think that has its roots in slavery. Slavers justified enslavement through religion. They taught enslaved Africans about religion, and this was really a way to kind of keep them in check and keep them subservient. But always Christianity and religion and their belief in God and their spirituality offered to the enslaved person hope that they would overcome the disadvantage of slavery. There was always hope there. Lots of the work that comes out of the Black quilt community deals with spirituality. In fact, we have an exhibition that was sponsored by the Museum of Biblical Art, and it dealt with how African Americans view their relationship with God and their spirituality. So we are still a hopeful people, and especially even now, even though times are better, they're kind of worst. So we are still a people of hope and a people of faith. And you see many quilts made in the Black community that surround these topics. So with that said, and knowing Harriet Powers had one of the earliest quilts that dealt with the Bible, of course she's going to be a favorite of the African American quilt community. And when you think in terms of the overall work that's created nationally, narrative quilts as opposed to traditional quilts and contemporary quilts, we have a love affair of narrative works. Most of the work coming out of the Black community is narrative. This is what I collect as a collector, narrative quilts. We're people with a lot of stories to tell, and we continue to tell them. But as well, we continue to celebrate the life of Harriet Powers. So much so that in, I believe it was 1997, we had a network member in Tallahassee, Florida, that did a commemorative exhibition called The Daughters of Harriet Powers. And people from African American quilters from around the United States participated in that show. Well, we're about to mount another show I'm working on, and it too is called The Daughters of Harriet Powers. We never get tired of celebrating Harriet Powers' life and Harriet Powers' quilts. When we talk about her being the mother of African American quilt making, we mean just that. She is. She's an example. She's the mother of African American quilting. So we celebrate her.
That's amazing. Yes, thank you. And I love how you said that her quilt reminds you of hope, and people that see it, they see so much hope in that particular quilt, the Bible quilt. That's amazing. Kyra, you also have you've documented the sort of the path that these two quilts took in your book, that which came out in 2009. So can you maybe just talk briefly about those two quilts and how they got to the two respective museums where they are now?
Sure. My work in This I Accomplished did exactly that. I wanted to find who are the people who touched the quilts and how did two quilts by an enslaved person get into a major museum um, hundreds of years later? How did that happen? And for the pictorial quilt that's at Jennifer's museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, um, that came about because a group of women saw the Bible quilt that the Smithsonian has at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition. Um, she that quilt that was at the Atlanta Cotton Exposition. The story is that some ladies um, from Atlanta University saw it and commissioned Mrs. Powers to make the quilt as a gift. And it was made as a gift to a gentleman who was on the board of directors of the school on the occasion of him becoming the president of a seminary in New York City. The quilt stayed in the family, and it was one of his sons that sold it, I think son or grandson, who was a Presbyterian pastor who sold it, I believe, because they needed some money. And keep me honest, Jennifer, but I believe at the Boston Historical Society is part of the correspondence about the sale of the quilt, and that it's sold for $500, I believe, to the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Yeah, that was all.
There was a step in between, but I think that is that's the right price. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
And it was a curator, not unlike Jennifer, who saw it and asked that a particular folk art collector and fine arts collector there at the museum purchase the quilt on behalf of the museum.
And what year was that, or about?
It was Max. I'm not going to say his name. Maxim Carolyn.
Yes, you said it perfectly. Yes. Maxim Carolyn.
He and his wife. There's a whole story about that, but that's more drama. Read the book.
Yes, get the book.
I mean, it's like soap opera drama. But he purchased it from the family that originally owned the quilt, and that is how that particular quilt got to the Boston Museum. Harriet Powers' quilt that's at the Smithsonian, a woman by the name of Jenny Smith, who was an art teacher at a girls' school in Athens, Georgia, saw a Mrs. Powers quilt at a local fair and wanted to buy it. And Mrs. Powers said no. But it was a couple of years later when Mrs. Powers and her family needed money. And they went back to Jenny Smith and asked, "Are you still interested?" And at first, Jenny Smith years ago was going to purchase the quilt for $10. And she told Mrs. Powers when asked that second time if she would purchase the quilt, she said, "I can buy it, but just $5. And I remember being so perturbed. I was going to use a different word, but being so perturbed at the $5. But I have since read Jenny Smith's papers and diaries that are at the University of Georgia, the University of Georgia Library in their rare books collection, where Jenny Smith really didn't have a lot of money at that point. I've seen correspondence where she really didn't have, and so $5 actually would have meant a lot to even Jenny Smith. But she purchased the quilt, and Mrs. Powers extracted a promise. Can I come visit it? And Jenny Smith also gave her scraps, fabric scraps. I think as much as I was anguished by that $5 monetary transaction, had it not been for that, we wouldn't be on this call today. Because that quilt got saved, and Jenny Smith kept it. She exhibited that quilt later on. She was a marketer in her own right. And when she died, a very fascinating read is her will. If you can, read the will, because the will said everything that's in the house that's not supposed to go to somebody specifically was to be sold for the benefit of the University of Georgia Library. the University of Georgia Athens Library. So potentially this quilt should have been sold to somebody, but it wasn't. It was actually kept by the executor of Mr. Smith's estate. He and his wife kept that quilt for about 20 years. And then he thought, this is really beautiful. It should be in a place of public setting. And another colleague of his, he was the accounting professor, department chair at the University of Georgia. A colleague of his in the library suggested the Smithsonian. And if you were to go to the Smithsonian, there's actually correspondence. And the curator there at the time, Doris
Bowman.
Doris Bowman, yes, who's still alive, by the way. Doris Bowman wrote a letter and gave a like a certificate to have it just sent through the mail. It went through the mail. And when I talked to Miss Bowman, she said it was so unlike anything that they'd ever seen that yes, they wanted the Smithsonian to accept the Bible quilts. And the executor actually donated 2 quilts, the Bible quilt and a Tree of Life, an unfinished Tree of Life quilt. I have no idea if Harriet Powers worked on the Tree of Life quilt. The last thing I'll say is when that quilt, the Bible quilt, was given to the Smithsonian, it came with Jenny Smith's handwritten notes where she talked to Mrs. Powers and had Mrs. Powers explain what each of the blocks meant. And so
they were kept together.
Yes, it was
kept. She kept her promise.
Yes. And while which is wonderful because you have documentation, and then Jennifer correct me if I'm wrong, but at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, there's a picture or there's something that's framed that talks about the quilt blocks as well. The wife of the minister that gave the quilt wrote down what the blocks meant.
And you pointed out in your book too, in the words of Harriet Powers.
Yes, in the words of Harriet Powers. And then just lastly, the book title is This I Accomplish. In my research, I located a letter by Mrs. Powers. And you know how we would sign, best wishes or sincerely or yours truly? She signed it, This I Accomplish. And I'm like, oh yeah, as soon as I read that, that's the title. Can you imagine? This I Accomplish.
That's so amazing. What a great line and a great title. And I remember reading that and cheering you on for finding all of that data. It was just so fun.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Aisha, tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you discover your relations, you and your family to this amazing quilter, and how does it feel to be connected to someone so famous? And
For me and my siblings, it was more so in 99, I think it was, when it was, we went to a forum led by a quilter, and we discovered that this lady was speaking about Harriet Powers, and my dad was like, that's my great-great-grandmother. And we went hoping that we could ask questions and does anybody know this lady, because during his journey as a young adult, hearing the name mentioned or just hearing that we have family in Athens, Georgia, because we're from Baltimore, nobody could elaborate on that. So he had been searching since like the 70s. And now here we are in the 90s, and we go and we listen, and we end up hearing more about her. And our thing was always like, this is like Alex Haley in reverse, because he went looking for his roots, and our roots are coming to us like, oh,
looking
get
for
this
you
book and read this book and da da da. So I think the first book we read, and I'm so sorry I can't remember who wrote it, but it was describing her her quilting technique, and traced it back to Dahomey, West Africa, which is present day Benin. Yes. And so it was just like at that point, now we're royal. Like, if we're not royalty, we're close to the royals, close enough that they're saying this stitching is only found on royals, And so it's like, well, if she wasn't, then she was definitely like quilting for them and stitching for them. And so it just gave us a sense of pride that, oh yeah, we come from somewhere, like, now we know. And then like I said, in 99, the AJC was writing an article because a replica of the quilt was coming to the Atlanta History Museum, and they interviewed us, and it was just like, wow, this is big.
It
This
is
is
big.
big.
Yes. Yeah.
So that was my first introduction to her, because my dad couldn't really tell us a lot because he didn't know a lot.
Yeah.
So now we're just kind of discovering it through books, and then eventually back back in the very beginning of the internet, there was no Google, but it was a search engine called Dog Piles. So we were like typing in and getting all the information we could off a dog pile, and it just became like, it became a thing where it's like, okay, yeah, we have somebody famous in the family. Like, this lady is almost like a god. But then, honestly, if I can be real honest, it kind of fizzled, because it just got to the point where when we talk about it, it's like, oh yeah, by the way, like, I have a great great grandmother, or with my dad, I have my great great grandmother. Her quilt is in the Smithsonian. No big
Yeah.
deal.
Yeah.
But she's just a big deal.
Yes.
So yeah, that's
But then you went to the ceremony, right? So how
I
did
went
that
to the
feel?
ceremony. Thank you to everybody who had a hand in putting that together. That it was so beautiful. Um it just took me back. Honestly, it took me back to the day that we really started getting more information about her. And the day of the ceremony, for me, it was emotional, because when I looked around and I saw like everybody who committed a portion of their lives to finding out who this lady is and loving her as if she was their own, because she is, and making her so, like, human making her human, and not just another slave who did something, because in our family, we like to think that, going off of what Miss Carolyn said, we like to think that her quilts were more than just Bible stories, because honestly, the family is all spread apart. Like, so we kind of felt like her connection was more so like a Harriet Tubman, like, we don't know the other quilts that she made, so we don't know if, in our minds, they were roadmaps to get out the South and go to freedom. And so being there that day, I really got emotional, because I wish that my dad and his mom was there. I wish that I wasn't the only representative from my portion of the family to be there. I really wanted everybody else to be there, but and I spread the word. I did, Miss Hicks. But I was there and I was representing. So not only was I taking it all in to be able to relay it all back to them and show them videos and pictures, and I mailed out the programs and everything, but just taking it in, thinking like, pretty much like, wow, look at what she has accomplished, i.e., what we have accomplished. And I really I wish my dad and her great granddaughter could have been there to just see it, because it was a beautiful day. And like I said, just the love that everybody had to even go that far to figure out where she was buried, to find out that there was no headstone, and then to create one for she and her husband. It was
Yes.
beyond words. I definitely cried when I got in the car and I was driving back to Atlanta, because it was just very overwhelming.
It was so moving. I can't imagine being part of her family, how it felt, but even for
Yeah.
me.
I
And
mean, because that's the same ground that was there like hundreds of years ago.
yes.
So not only was it that, but it was just like, wow, like, you don't really think, living in a world today with all this technology and everything, we don't really think like wars took place on this ground, and this lady survived so much, like, and she was able to push her people out to keep her bloodline going.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another thing. Like, her bloodline is strong.
Yes. Yeah. And like you said, the story that you and Carolyn both mentioned about the how the Women of Color Quilters Networks found the grave again after so many years. And I interviewed them for the Quiltfolk Georgia edition. So their story is in there as well as, and so many photos of the beautiful ceremony too. So Jennifer, you guys are, have this really wonderful opportunity to house this quilt and preserve it and take care of it. And I'm sure you get asked every day why it's not on view all the time, but maybe you could talk a little bit about just the care and preservation of the quilt. And we're talking about the pictorial quilt, and just how you care for it and how you choose when and how to put it on exhibit.
Well, thank you, Teresa. And Aisha, I think it's such an honor to be here. Actually, it's an honor to be here with everyone. And I agree that that moment of coming together to celebrate the life of Harriet and Armistead Powers in Athens, Georgia, and to mark the occasion of having a new headstone, was so moving, and it was a privilege to be there. As it is, it's a privilege for the MFA to be stewards and really custodians of the Harriet Powers pictorial quilt. And as such, I think I know that generations of curators have taken the responsibility very seriously, not only to preserve the quilt to the extent that it is possible for future generations, so that just like the carte de visite of Harriet Powers holding her piece of cloth with the scissors that Kyra discovered in the pocket, and the description of each block in her own words, that all of this and all of the layers of scholarship and interest and visits, they're all recorded, again, for future generations, because I think that everyone, like all great works of art, the pictorial quilt means so many things to so many people, and has in the past and will continue to do that. And I think, Aisha, your point about how, there are peaks of interest, and then it sort of kind of flattens out, and then there's another peak. And so we just need to be there to make sure that every new generation or every new person who is seeing the quilt and discovering more about its history, which will only continue to grow, that there is something there. And the one thing that, Kyra, I'm glad you pointed out that both quilts were actually displayed by their owners before they came to their respective museums, either the Smithsonian or the Museum of Fine Arts. And, that was part of their history, and understanding that is important. But if you, I cannot say more emphatically that This I Accomplish is such an important book to read. Kyra Hicks, you are an amazing scholar, artist, and researcher. But the stories of how the pictorial quilt, and really the Bible quilt, how it looked when it was first displayed at the Cotton States Fair, are very different than both quilts look today. And that's just the nature of the light sensitivity of textiles. So if you look,
so the colors are completely faded. When we see it today, it looks brownish.
Yes, and for different reasons. So the sort of kind of brownish green was more of a green. That's a fugitive color that's not very stable. That happens in a lot of quilts. It has nothing to do with light exposure. It's just the nature of the dye at that time. And but then you can also see those background colors where there was a little more pink. You look at the edge of the some of the applique, you can see just a remnant of what would have been a pink ground. And it's interesting because we talked about, and this is again a part of a public institution's role as making sure that the works of art remain accessible to people over time. The information about the work of art remains accessible because it is in the public trust. but then also sort of how you interpret it, or ask questions of visitors and provide visitors with interpretation, which is of course acknowledging that that is not the only way to look at a work of art. And if we, let's say we did a visual or virtual recreation of one of the blocks in the colors that we might estimate what the original color was in the moment that Harriet Powers made the quilt. Is that the right thing to do? Are we taking something away from what an individual might bring in their own understanding of the quilt in their own time and looking at it? And not to say, so I think that is something that a lot of people don't realize about sort of.
So you're saying if you took the quilt and colorized it,
yes, if you made an image
with what colors you think it might have been at the time, does that change our interpretation of it?
Does it close off some looking? Does it close off close looking? Because really, I mean, having an object on view in an exhibition is an invitation to come and have, if you are able to physically get to the institution or the venue, it's an invitation for an individual to have their own experience, right? And so I think it's really important that museums don't provide all the answers, but in fact ask questions, open up different ways of thinking, so that when people come together, let's say, this is my most favorite thing about working in a museum, is going into an exhibition and seeing two strangers stand in front of a work of art and talk to each other about what they're seeing. And so and so that is really what keeps us all going, is that it's highly motivating and also highly rewarding to be able to do that. And also, as you said, Teresa, like more practically, just make sure that scholars, descendants, everyone who has a feeling for this quilt, to the extent that we are able to make it available to people. And so normally it is not on view, and it is rolled and carefully stored in darkness, and because that light will cause the colors to fade. But it's always a considered. There's always it's always a complicated decision, where we rely on guidelines and the expertise of our colleagues in textile conservation, but we have broader conversations because it's really important that the Harriet Powers quilt is seen by as many people as possible when it is on view.
Yeah, I'm sure it's this constant struggle of seen and preserved, right? Carolyn, maybe Jennifer, anyone, y'all can sort of jump in on this next question, but I was curious. So, in the late 1800s, when these two quilts were made, most quilt makers were following patterns and repeating what had been made before them, and were very interested in, very precise points and all of these things. And here we have these two quilts that are, number one, were never, as far as I know, you can correct me, were never intended to be bed coverings. And number two, are completely original works of art, with original designs, which really just didn't happen that much, especially, as you said, Carolyn, in a narrative form. So I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about that. As part of their most endearing quality, I think, is this incredible originality.
I will use the show that I'm currently curating and right now, that is inspired by Harriet Powers, and I've seen some of the work. It's extraordinary.
You're going to cry.
Absolutely extraordinary. There's, first of all, I have to say, there's just so much talent in WCQN. What has changed, though, is the materials and the methods by which quilt makers use to construct their quilts. So, whereas quilting has been modernized with these techniques, the passion and inspiration remains the same. but the high caliber of technique and different materials is evident in this new exhibition. So I have found the quilts that I've seen extraordinary. They really are absolutely amazing.
Now, you have a new quilt, Carolyn. Is it part of that exhibition?
Well, I don't put my quilts in exhibitions that I curate, but I just came back from that ceremony and wanted to make a Harriet Powers quilt. So
Tell us a little bit about this. First of all, it's 8 feet tall, so larger than life.
yeah, well, Harriet Powers is larger than life, and
Yes.
Oh, wow.
for myself, I don't like. I can't make small quilts. I'm a big.
Oh,
I'm a
wow.
big woman. I like big, substantial things. So, anyway, the inspiration for this was not only Harriet Powers, but also a photograph that Kyra Hicks had redone. And she sent me that photograph, and I thought, gee, this is just absolutely fabulous. And it was at that time that those scissors were pictured on the photograph. And I thought, gee, okay, I have to make a quilt. And that's what I came up with.
It's just stunning,
Carolyn.
Carolyn. So
Bravo.
beautiful.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope to see it in person one day.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Thanks.
Can you make an exception to your rule and put it in the exhibition?
I can't do that.
I think we'd all be fine with that.
No. Well, ethically, it's just not the right thing. As curator, I'm
That is true. Yeah.
just can't jury on your own work. But as I said, the works that I've seen so far are just extraordinary. So I'm working on a special venue for this
Wonderful.
work.
Yeah. Kyra, tell us a little bit about, so at the headstone has been placed. It was the recommittal ceremony was in December of 2023. The Women of Quilters Color Network organized it and hosted the event. It was 140 some people there that day. And so the headstone, you helped design the back of it. Talk a little bit about that process. And you also have the details from her quilts.
Sure. Well, I'm going to also ask Carolyn to jump in. Really, one of the things I did as it relates to the headstone is I went to a local cemetery here in Alexandria, Virginia, to look, and it's an old cemetery. But I wanted to see like what size is our headstone. It's not something I know about. If I'm standing, if I look in the distance, can I see something? Does it have presence? And so I did all these. I spent a couple of hours taking measurements and looking to see what was lovely and so forth. And really was in collaboration with Dr. Mazloomi to say, how do we have something that's not just words? And I think jointly, I mean, yes, I did sketch. I cannot draw, but I did kind of sketch things and shared it with Dr. Mazloomi, who had final decisions. So it was more collaborative than sometimes she says. Don't you think, Dr.
Kyra is the designer.
Well, it's just a beautiful, beautiful stone.
Can I just say, though, it was absolutely amazing to have researched this woman's life and to know academically that there's going to be a headstone there. It's going to be this black thing. There's probably going to be so. The first time I saw it, I'm almost going to cry now. It was so amazing that we're able to honor her and her family more than 100 years later. And just the height of it, it's not going to go away. It will not be broken. It will not be stolen. It will not, all of those things. It will be there for Aisha's children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren. This weekend, I was on Ancestry.com. Since December, I've been fascinated with Mrs. Powers' family. It's like, what happened to her children and her grandchildren? And so I even hired a genealogist
Wow.
because there was two children that were missing, or grandchildren. We found them, and the family story is absolutely amazing. This weekend, and then I'll hush, but this weekend I learned, with the help of the genealogist, and then we went back and kind of verified our research, that one of her grandsons, the name changed from Powers to Powell, P-O-E-L-L.
Oh.
And there is a whole contingency in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that at least on Ancestry.com, when I look at family trees going back up from the contingency in Chattanooga, they have no idea that they're related to Harriet Powers. Because
so
in the census record, the name change went from Powers to Powell, and I can see where it kind of changed back and forth in the 1910, 1920, 1930s. And then I guess the family kept the name Powell for whatever reason. And so I was like, and when I was working on the book, somebody sent me, and I just saw it recently, and I can't find it yet and re-find it in my office at home. Somebody sent me back when I was working on the book, saying that they were part of her family and their last name was Powell. And I was too young to think, no, you're not it, or no, the name is Powers. And I just came across it. It was an older gentleman who hand wrote that he was a member of Harriet Powers' family. And I was too, what is the word, inexperienced to recognize that that was a possibility. But I did keep the paperwork. So I want to find the paperwork to see if it's this gentleman. But yeah, there's a whole contingency in Chattanooga. Aisha, you got some kin just over.
Yeah, I was gonna say though, it's funny because when I would be speaking with my dad's mom, she had a brother, and honestly, I don't even know if I think he passed away, but her brother's last name was Powers, like he was a male descendant. But I remember her saying one time that they mix up their names, so sometimes they would go by Powell, but it's really Powers. That's what she told me. And when you were saying that, it just clicked, like, oh yeah, because that's what was happening. And her brother had a son, which would be her great-great grandson. And he's young. He's like in his 30s. My brother knows how to be in touch with him, because he, at one point, my brother was like taking care of him, because he's like about a good 10-12 years older than him. My brother is. But unfortunately, when he was born, we pushed, my dad and I pushed to have his last name remain Powers, but his mom named him, unfortunately, after the people that helped her in the hospital. But he is a direct bloodline, like he's a male child to keep the bloodline going.
Well,
his name is Mark. I forget what Mark's last name is though.
We'll be in touch. And can I just say for the record, Aisha's, is it an aunt, Yvette Carter?
Yeah.
We had breakfast in Baltimore a couple of weeks ago. She is wonderful. We talked on the phone for years, and I met Yvette's mother, who I can't think the relationship to you.
Janie.
Yes.
Janie before she passed.
Who was a descendant of Mrs. Powers. We had.
Yep, that's her brother I was talking about.
Yeah, we had a ball going through the family tree. So.
Yay! I'm so glad you finally got to meet her in person. She is a seamstress.
Yes.
Now I don't know if she does it anymore, but it's always it's always, that's been her thing. Like, I used to be in awe of her because she would make wedding gowns for people with no patterns. She would just work. And it was always like, where do you get this from? You know,
in the DNA.
She made my 5th grade graduation ceremony dress, no pattern. I just told her what I wanted, and she made it. But that was her thing. Like, she didn't really, or she would make her own patterns. Like, she didn't really use anything other than just what was naturally in her, is all we can now say, because we always would be like, wow, like, how do you, like, where did this come from?
Yeah.
Where did this come from? Everybody's so artistic, on my side at least. I don't know about everybody else. I'm learning and meeting other people. But yeah, we will always wonder, like, where did you get this from, Yvette? And so
yeah,
I think I think I have a clear idea where she got it from now.
Aisha, what do you say to all the quilters out there? Like, what do you hope Harriet's legacy is going forward, and just what do you know? What would you want to share with everyone who already
Well,
loves her?
to all the quilters, I gotta start by saying thank you. Thank you, because you guys have done so much with just introducing her to us, to my family, and that's all the branches everywhere. And then and just keeping her, I'm sorry, I don't know if we got cut, but just keeping her, you guys have been the ones keeping her legacy alive. And I would just say, like, let's keep doing it, and let me join you this time.
Yeah.
Let me join you at this point, because I in preparation for this conversation today, I went back, and my dad passed in '03. So I remember, like, I threw a lot out because I was just mad, but that's another story. Um, but I saved a lot, and I went back into one of his portfolios, and I saw one of his um, one of his dreams to keep Harriet Powers' legacy alive was to create a foundation for creatives. And that would be anybody, whether you're a quilter or a seamstress or a performing arts. It was just a a place where creatives can just come and create. And it looked like through his working it out, he wanted to call it Grandma's house. Which I thought was nice. But I just say, let's she's more than just an American treasure. And I know this is sounding very backwards, but she is definitely African American history at its best. And I would love to see more about her in schools, even just bringing back quilting as a mainstream thing, and not something that older ladies do.
Yeah. She is a treasure.
Older ladies in the South, probably specifically, is what a lot of people think. But I want to join forces. I want to keep it alive. I want to keep the art going. I don't stitch very well.
It's okay.
But I want to learn something, and I want to be able to help all the quilters keep her legacy alive.
That's so awesome. Thank you. So well said.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jennifer, okay, tell us, there's a chance to go and see the Pictorial Quilt. Where will it be?
Well, we're very fortunate to have found another venue for Fabric of a Nation, American Quilt Stories, at the Cummer Museum of Art and Gardens in Jacksonville, Florida. And the Harriet Powers Pictorial Quilt will be at the center of the exhibition on view. Yay. And the exhibition will open at the Cummer Museum on July 5th. And it will close at the end of September. So I hope that people are able to get to Jacksonville, Florida to see it on view. The show's going to look beautiful there. And I will continue to share everything I know about any programming that they're going to be doing for the exhibition with all of you. And I think it's important to come and visit and bring your friends. And I think you're right, Aisha. We have to bring the younger generation in, and so they can have their own. They can fall in love with the Harriet Powers quilt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That whole exhibition.
I'm coming.
Is beautiful, but yeah, wonderful. I would like to come too. It's a little bit of a trek from Houston, but we can do it. Thank you all so much. I'm just so excited that you all were able to take time to be with us today. Brianna and I loved covering this story for Quiltfolk. The Georgia edition is very special, and just primarily because of this story, and that we were so fortunate to be there and take part in that day with you. And we're just so pleased. And I just want to thank you again for your participation today, and all that each one of you have done to help preserve Harriet's story and keep her legacy alive and share it with everyone else. An incredible group of women today. I'm super excited to be part of this with you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Good
Bye-bye.
afternoon.